I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. Wherever you are, I invite you to dim your lights, ease yourself under the warmth of your blanket, and let the day dissolve like sugar melting in a quiet cup of tea. Tonight we'll drift into a story that is not exciting, not loud, but gently peculiar. The sort of history that soothes the mind and softens the heart. And if this calm journey helps you unwind, feel free to tap like, or even subscribe, only if it feels right, and only if it adds to your peace. And as you settle in, I wonder, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there in your own quiet corner? You needn't do anything now. Just listen. The slow rhythm of my words will carry you, like a leaf on a quiet stream. You'll notice your breathing matching the tempo, deeper in, slower out, until your body remembers what rest feels like. Now, let us wander back, together, into a world of lace curtains, coal smoke and quiet discipline. We are stepping into Victorian England, and here, curiously enough, children were sometimes punished with poetry. The classroom was colder than anyone wanted to admit. Tall windows rattled with the January wind, and a grey light spilled across wooden desks that had been scratched by generations of restless hands. Ink stains lingered in blotches, little black ghosts of past mistakes. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the shuffle of boots on stone, the whisper of wool against wood, the faint sigh of children trying not to be noticed. Mr. Barrow, the teacher, stood like a sentry at the front, his spectacles balanced neatly on the bridge of his nose, reflecting slivers of pale daylight. He was not cruel by the standards of his time, though truth be told, Victorian standards set a rather high bar for cruelty. No, his preferred weapon was not the cane. Instead, it was poetry. A boy, perhaps 12, had whispered to his neighbour, and in that small slip of sound the punishment was decided. Mr. Barrow raised a finger, and the boy, Henry with hair sticking up like hay after a restless nap, was told to stand. There would be no ruler smacking the desk, no march to the corner with red cheeks. Instead, Henry was handed a leather-bound volume and instructed to begin. The poem chosen was not brief. It rarely was. Sometimes it was Cowper with his meditations on morality. Other times a stern passage from Pope. Today, however, it was The Seasons by James Thomson, a work stretching like a river, long and winding, flowing endlessly with imagery of fields, harvests, and industrious labour. To a restless child, it was not the bright stream of a brook, but the slow crawl of mud in winter. Henry opened the book, the musty paper releasing a faint scent, like dried leaves stored in a box for too many years. He swallowed, his voice small at first. From brightening fields of ether, fair disclosed. The other children shifted in their seats. Some stifled giggles. Others tried not to look at him, for fear of catching the teacher's eye. The rhythm of the poem, steady and unyielding, began to fill the cold air. Imagine, if you will, the sensation of reciting words you only half understand. Each line like a heavy stone you must carry across a field. You lift it, you speak it, and then another waits, and another. No cane strikes your skin. Instead, you are worn down by the sheer length of the verse, the slow march of syllables. It was a punishment both subtle and exhausting. Not pain, but tedium. And in that tedium, a lesson. That patience and obedience could be drilled not only through sharp blows, but through the soft drone of rhyme. Doesn't it feel strange? That in the Victorian mind, poetry could wound as effectively as wood? And yet, for those listening, well, it had its lulling qualities. The cadence, the repetition, the rise and fall of Henry's thin voice. One could almost drift off, lulled by the endless river of words, like a lullaby that forgot it was supposed to end. Henry's voice wavered like a candle flame in a draught. He stumbled on a word, vernal, and paused, his lips working uncertainly, before Mr. Barrow cleared his throat with a polite but pointed sound. The boy corrected himself, cheeks pink, and pressed onward. The classroom had grown strangely still. The scrape of boots ceased, the coughs quieted. Even the fire, low and sulking in the grate, seemed to hush. The rhythm of the poem began to dominate the room, steady and relentless, a kind of verbal pendulum swinging back and forth, back and forth. It's curious, isn't it, how sound can change a space? Imagine yourself there, eyes drooping as the words pool in your ears like warm rain. Each line is heavy yet predictable. Each pause a small relief. You may not care for the meaning, but the cadence. The cadence has its own peculiar comfort, like the sound of a distant train or the endless hum of bees in summer grass. Mr. Barrow folded his hands behind his back. To him, this was discipline at its most refined. No need for welts across knuckles or frightened tears. Let the child endure the length of verse. Let the weight of tradition bear down slowly, patiently. After all, the Victorians prized patience, even when delivered in the dull wrappings of didactic rhyme. Henry trudged onward. His small mouth formed words like stepping stones across a river, and every slip drew a murmur of correction. He reached a passage about shepherds, their flocks dotting the hillside. For a moment one could almost picture it, the woolly shapes, the low bleating carried on the breeze. Yet even that image, soft and pastoral, dragged itself out into an endless stanza that coiled on and on. Can you imagine being 11, longing to play and instead being shackled by rhyme? Your body restless, your legs itching to run, but your voice tethered to metre and rhyme. There is a kind of invisible rope in poetry, binding you line by line, refusing to let you wander off. Some of the younger children fought yawns. They rested their chins in their hands, eyes blinking slower with each couplet. Henry's punishment became their lullaby. A dull one, perhaps, but strangely soothing in its monotony. The drone of a single voice, the repetitive drum of syllables, it was almost hypnotic. And here lies the strange magic of Victorian punishments. Designed to weary, they sometimes comforted. A recitation could double as a bedtime charm. The very thing meant to exhaust the will might instead ease the mind into drifting states. The clock ticked on, steady as ever. The light dimmed, clouds covering the pale sun outside. The classroom seemed to shrink into itself, all sound reduced to the quiet spill of poetry. Mr. Barrow finally lifted a hand. "Enough, Henry," he said at last. The boy stopped mid-line, the words dying in his throat like a bird startled mid-flight. He sank into his seat with relief. The book closed like a coffin over the verse. And yet, for a time, the rhythm lingered. In the stillness of that grey morning, every child carried the echo of the poem, like a hum left in the ear after a bell. Tell me, wouldn't you drift too, hearing the slow parade of stanzas, the steady cadence that neither hurried nor faltered? Perhaps punishment, in its dullest form, is simply the cousin of sleep. When Henry sat down, the room did not immediately return to life. The children remained hushed, their minds still wrapped in the echo of lines he had spoken. It was as if the verses had stitched themselves into the very air, weaving a slow-moving net that settled over every desk and every bowed head. Mr. Barrow cleared his throat again, not out of irritation this time, but in satisfaction. He adjusted his waistcoat, smoothed the edge of his moustache, and glanced across the rows of young faces. In his eyes, order had been restored, and order for him was always more valuable than joy. Outside the tall windows, the weather seemed to mimic the rhythm of the lesson. A fine mist pressed against the glass, tiny droplets slipping downward in lazy streaks. Occasionally the faint sound of a cart rattled past on the street, wheels crunching over stones, the horse's breath clouding in the chill. But here inside, it was the sound of poetry, long, weary poetry, that defined the atmosphere. A girl named Clara, seated in the front, twisted her ribbon absently as she stared at the floor. She had not been punished this day, yet she could not escape the sense of being pulled under by Henry's recitation. To her, the lines felt like the turning of a giant wheel, round and round, always circling back, never truly stopping. She wondered if this was how time itself felt to grown men and women. Slow, weighty, endlessly repeating. Isn't it curious how children can find philosophy hidden, even in boredom? A simple verse forced upon them becomes a meditation on existence without them even realizing it. At the back of the room, Thomas yawned. His elbow slid from the desk and his chin nearly struck the wood before he caught himself. His eyes blinked furiously, as though fighting the pull of slumber. To him, Henry's punishment had been a lullaby, not a lesson, and in some corner of his young mind he may have thought, better to be the punished than the listener. For at least when you spoke, you stayed awake. Mr. Barrow, however, believed he had achieved brilliance. In his ledger, where he noted each child's failings, he scribbled in neat ink, disrupted class, punished with recitation, order restored. His handwriting was elegant, almost ornamental, curling letters like vines across the page. One could imagine the satisfaction he felt knowing that, instead of bruises, he left behind neat little entries, punishments dressed up as literacy. The children might never love poetry, but they would remember it. Not for beauty, but for endurance. And isn't endurance its own kind of education? That was, at least, the philosophy of many Victorian schools. To suffer through tedium was to prepare for the tedious duties of adulthood. The long hours in factories, the repetition of clerks, the drudgery of household chores. Life was lines, endless lines, and poetry was simply a rehearsal. The room smelled faintly of chalk now, the dust rising as Mr. Barrow wrote a proverb on the board. The squeak of the stick against slate broke the silence. Words appeared in pale strokes, their meaning moral, their sound dull. But beneath the squeak you might still hear the phantom rhythm of Henry's voice. For boredom has a way of lingering, doesn't it? Like the aftertaste of a stale biscuit. Dry, faintly bitter, and refusing to disappear no matter how much water you drink. One child, perhaps, might have dreamed of cakes instead. Soft buns sold by bakers in the street, warm currant loaves, the sweet dusting of sugar across crusts. And what a contrast that must have been. The sweetness of imagined bread against the endless grey of verse. Punishment and pastry side by side, one dull as stone, the other comforting as a grandmother's hand. And still the day crawled on. The clock in the corner gave a slow chime, not the bright peal of a church bell, but a tired metallic note, like a spoon tapping the rim of a kettle. Each strike rolled through the classroom, counting not only the hour, but also the endurance of those sitting so stiffly at their desks. Outside, the fog thickened. If you closed your eyes, you could imagine it seeping under the door, curling around your ankles, as though even the weather wanted to join the lesson in dull grey silence. The horse carts grew fainter. The sounds of the town became muffled. All that truly existed in that small world was the scrape of chalk, the smell of coal, and the memory of Henry's weary recitation. Mr. Barrow turned to face the room again. His eyes moved slowly from child to child like lantern lights sweeping across a row of statues. He paused, then selected another target. "Clara," he said softly. The girl stiffened. Her ribbon slipped from her fingers and dangled uselessly. She rose to her feet with the awkwardness of someone suddenly made visible. The teacher handed her the book, heavy, leather-bound, smelling faintly of dampness. She looked down at the page, her lashes fluttering. The words swam for a moment. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, she began, "Lo, swelling loud, the tempest shakes the dome." Her voice was steadier than Henry's, but thinner, carrying the fragility of a bird's call. It filled the silence like smoke curling into every corner. The children leaned forward slightly, not from interest but from the involuntary pull of sound. It is remarkable, isn't it, how punishment spreads like a yawn. One child begins, another follows, and soon the entire room shares in the same heaviness. Clara's voice was not loud, yet it was insistent. Line after line, couplet after couplet, her rhythm became a second heartbeat in the classroom. Somewhere outside, a street seller cried out faintly, "Hot pies! Fresh pies!" But his voice was swallowed by the fog. Only Clara's recital remained. Imagine standing there, small hands gripping the edge of the book, your feet aching from stillness. Imagine your throat growing dry, the taste of dust rising as you form each syllable. You want to cough, but you cannot. You want to sit, but you must endure. Poetry becomes both a cage and a chain, binding you by expectation. Mr. Barrow listened intently, nodding as though each line were a nail hammered into the plank of discipline. To him, this was virtue. To the children, it was simply time stretched thin, thinner, thinnest, until it almost tore apart. Clara reached a verse about storms at sea. The words painted ships tossed on waves, sailors clinging to ropes, thunder booming overhead. Yet her voice was calm, slow, unchanging. The terror of the storm became oddly comforting, delivered in that steady drone. The violent ocean was turned into a lullaby. Isn't that strange? That even chaos, when read in the right monotone, can soothe? That fear itself can become a sleep aid when wrapped in the gauze of old rhyme? Some of the smaller children closed their eyes briefly, pretending to listen while drifting toward dreams. In their minds, the poem blurred into softer shapes. Clouds instead of waves, pillows instead of ropes. When Clara faltered at a difficult word, Mr. Barrow corrected her with a single tap of the board. She nodded, repeated it properly, and continued. The lesson, the punishment, the lull. They all stretched seamlessly together. The coal fire hissed again, spitting a tiny spark. No one flinched. The room was too far gone into its spell of drowsy order. At last, Clara's voice grew faint, and Mr. Barrow raised a hand. She stopped mid-line, lips still forming a final word, then closed the book. She sat down slowly, as though the weight of the verse still pressed on her shoulders. The silence that followed was deeper than before, like the hush of snow settling over rooftops, and once again the room breathed in unison. The silence after Clara's voice faded was so complete it felt almost alive. The tick of the clock grew louder, as though it had been waiting for its turn to be heard. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound rolled out slow and steady, like drops of water falling into a deep well. The children sat motionless. Some blinked slowly, lashes heavy with sleep. Others stared at the floorboards, tracing invisible lines with their eyes. Henry rubbed his knuckles against the edge of his desk, still feeling the echo of his own ordeal, while Clara's cheeks burned faintly from standing so long. Mr. Barrow seemed content. His hands rested behind his back, his stance rigid yet calm like a soldier at ease. For him, discipline was not in the sting of wood against flesh, but in the rhythm of verse pressing on young ears until they yielded. He looked at the rows of pupils and after a pause chose another. Thomas, he said quietly. A stir passed through the back row. Thomas, tall for his age, with unruly curls and a perpetual scowl, straightened reluctantly. He rose with a heavy sigh, which earned him a sharp glance from the teacher. The book was passed to him, thick and unyielding. Thomas opened it, frowned at the page, and began, "See, winter comes, to rule the varied year." His voice was deeper, rougher, carrying the rasp of disinterest. Yet even so, the rhythm crept in. Each line fell like the thud of boots on packed snow. Slowly, deliberately, he trudged through the stanza. The irony was not lost on the children. Winter itself was now the subject, and indeed the room felt frozen in his monotone. The imagery of frost, of bare branches, of biting winds, echoed too closely with the cold they felt at that very moment. The punishment was doubling, tripling in its weight. Imagine hearing about icy fields while your own toes ache in stiff boots, your fingers tingling inside thin gloves. The poem becomes less a lesson and more a mirror, reflecting your discomfort line by line. Somewhere beyond the fogged windows, a dog barked once and fell silent. A bell rang faintly from another street, marking the hour. The sound passed, yet Thomas continued, each verse dragging the children deeper into the grey lull of recitation. Isn't it fascinating how boredom itself has layers? At first it pricks at you, restless and irritating. Then, given time, it becomes almost soft, like a heavy quilt pressing you into stillness. That is what Thomas's recital did to the classroom. One boy, eyes drooping, pictured the words as shapes, long rectangles stacked one upon another, building a wall so high he could not see beyond it. A girl imagined the lines as steps of a staircase, spiralling upward without end. Each child in their own way felt the same truth, that the poem was endless, that it might last forever, and that all they could do was surrender. Thomas stumbled briefly, skipping a line, and Mr. Barrow tapped the desk. The boy corrected himself, muttering the verse more clearly, and then marched onward. His voice did not rise, did not fall, but remained flat like the steady plod of hooves across cobblestones. The fire gave a sigh. A puff of ash drifted upward. The smell of coal thickened for a moment, scratching at the throat. Yet no one moved, for Thomas's voice anchored them in place. When at last he reached the end of the assigned passage, he shut the book with a clap louder than expected. A few children jumped, startled out of their drowsy haze. Mr. Barrow narrowed his eyes, but he said nothing. With a nod, he permitted Thomas to sit. The hush that followed was almost heavier than before, layered with the fatigue of 3 long recitations. The children were not unruly now. They were subdued, weighed down by words. And in that heavy stillness, the schoolroom seemed to drift out of time altogether. The book now rested on the teacher's desk, its leather cover shut tight, as if to keep the verses from spilling any further into the room. Yet, even closed, it seemed to hum with the weight of lines unsaid. The children sat in their neat rows, shoulders slumped, bodies swaying ever so slightly in rhythm with their own drowsiness. It was as though the recitations had drained away not only their mischief, but their very sense of time. Hours, minutes, these no longer mattered. There was only the steady crawl of words that had been spoken and the silence that followed after. Mr. Barrow moved to the window. He pushed his spectacles higher on his nose and peered out into the fog. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips. He could barely make out the shapes of passers-by, muffled shadows carrying baskets or tugging along small children. The world outside seemed busy, in motion, full of errands and exchanges. But here inside, the classroom remained fixed, almost suspended, bound by the invisible threads of poetry. Behind him, Clara's ribbon slid once more through her fingers. She had tied it back into a knot, then untied it again, each motion slow, mechanical, the sort of fidget that keeps the mind awake in monotony. Henry had lowered his gaze to his desk, tracing circles in the grain of the wood. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair. The rebellious scowl faded now into a dull glaze of fatigue. Can you imagine it? 30 children, all captured not by fear, not by pain, but by sheer unrelenting tedium. Poetry as a net, not sharp, not cutting, but woven so thick that none could escape. The coal fire hissed again, collapsing inward with a faint crackle. Ash shifted in the grate, grey as the mist outside. A faint smell of sulphur clung to the air. For a moment, one of the boys coughed, the sound small, apologetic. Mr. Barrow turned, his eyes narrowing, and the boy immediately pressed his lips shut. Silence returned. The teacher lifted the book once more. His fingers tapped the spine thoughtfully, as though considering whether to open it again. A few children stiffened at the gesture, but he set it back down. Not this time. Instead, he spoke slowly, deliberately. Do you see what patience brings? No pain, no marks upon the hand, and yet order. Poetry is a teacher greater than the cane. The children nodded faintly, though whether from agreement or simple habit was impossible to tell. Perhaps they didn't believe it. Perhaps they didn't care. But they nodded because nodding was easier than resisting. And in that moment, something odd hung in the air. The punishment, the lesson, the silence, all blended into a lull. One could almost close their eyes and drift, imagining the droning verses still flowing somewhere like a stream you cannot see but always hear. Isn't it strange how even the dullest punishment can take on the shape of a lullaby? How words meant to weary can soothe instead. Outside, the fog deepened, cloaking the street in grey. The faint jingle of a milkman's cart passed, bells muffled by distance. Inside, the classroom remained a sealed world of dust, chalk, and half-forgotten rhyme. And so the lesson continued, not with shouts or blows, but with a silence that pressed down like a blanket, heavy yet strangely comforting. The classroom had become a world of whispers that no one dared to speak aloud. The fog outside pressed hard against the glass, and the faint silhouettes beyond looked like blurred sketches in a half-finished painting. Inside, the stillness was so heavy that every creak of the wooden desk sounded louder than it should, like footsteps in an empty church. Henry shifted slightly, his boots squeaking against the stone floor. He did not mean to disturb the quiet, but the sound escaped anyway. A few heads turned toward him. Mr. Barrow did not scold, but Henry's ears grew hot all the same. That is the nature of silence. It magnifies even the smallest movement until it feels like a crime. On the teacher's desk, the poetry book sat waiting. Its presence alone was enough to keep the children obedient. They knew at any moment another name could be called, another passage demanded. That leather spine was as effective as a whip, though it left no bruises. Mr. Barrow tapped the cover gently with one finger, almost absent-mindedly. The sound echoed faintly, tap, tap, as if reminding them of its power. Poetry, he said softly, is not only to be read, it is to be carried, into memory, into duty, into life. The words hung in the cold air, carried, like a weight or like a burden. He selected another child. Mary, a girl with braids wound tightly against her head, rose from her bench. She did not protest. She did not sigh. She simply stood, her eyes lowered to the page as the heavy book was placed in her hands. Her voice was higher, gentler, almost sing-song, though flattened by nervousness. "O winter, ruler of the inverted year!" The children braced themselves. Another stream of verse began to pour through the classroom. This time, the imagery of frost and snow layered itself over the already cold atmosphere. It was as though the room itself had grown icier with each couplet, the air thick with words that chilled rather than warmed. And yet, do you feel it too? There was a certain comfort in the predictability. Each line followed another in the same measured way. Each rhyme landed softly, like footsteps on packed snow. There was no surprise, no jolt, nothing sharp, just the endless unfolding of sound, smooth and unchanging. Somewhere in the back row, Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, not in defiance, but in surrender. The steady rhythm of Mary's voice lulled him, like a carriage rocking slowly along a road. He pictured himself drifting, the poem turning into the rumble of wheels, the sway of sleep. Punishment or lullaby, it was hard to tell the difference now. The clock ticked on. The fire had nearly gone out, leaving only a faint glow beneath the ash. The smell of soot lingered, dry and faintly metallic. Mary's voice wove through it all, a thin thread sewing the dull fabric of the day together. At last, Mr. Barrow raised his hand, and she stopped mid-line, the final syllable fading before it was complete. She closed the book and sank down, her braids brushing against her shoulders as she exhaled quietly. The silence that followed was once again immense. Not frightening, not painful, just vast, like the hush of snow falling over an empty street. And in that hush, one could almost hear the steady drift of sleep itself. The children hardly stirred now. They were not asleep, not quite, but their bodies had fallen into the same kind of stillness you see in statues. Only their eyes moved, occasionally darting toward the tall windows or toward the heavy book that still sat on Mr. Barrow's desk. That book had become a presence all its own, a silent guardian of discipline, its pages brimming with verses that none of them wished to meet again. Mr. Barrow seemed satisfied. His moustache twitched faintly as he clasped his hands behind his back. "You see," he said in his measured tone, "poetry sharpens memory. It tames the tongue. It teaches patience." He might have believed this fully, or perhaps he simply liked the order it brought. To him, silence was a treasure, and the long drone of verse was the lock that kept it safe. Outside, the fog thickened further. Drops clung to the glass like tiny pearls. Beyond, the faint outline of a lamplighter could be seen, raising his pole to spark the evening lamps. Though it was still day, the sky had grown heavy and dim, as if eager to fold itself into dusk. Inside, the classroom mirrored the gloom. The fire had all but died now, leaving only the occasional whisper of smoke. The smell of coal clung to the children's clothes, mixing with the tang of ink and the faint chalk dust that hung in the air. One boy, Peter, sat very straight at his desk. He had not yet been chosen, but his heart thudded each time Mr. Barrow's gaze swept the room. He knew it was only a matter of time, and perhaps, strange as it seems, part of him wanted it. Not out of bravery, but out of the heavy drowsiness that made listening harder than speaking. At least when you recited, you moved. Your lip-shaped words, your body remained awake. Isn't that curious? That a punishment might become a relief only because silence itself was heavier than rhyme? Mr. Barrow lifted the book again, his fingers smoothing the worn cover. He flipped to another passage, eyes narrowing as he selected the lines. Then, softly, he said, "Peter." The boy stood so quickly that his chair groaned against the floor. His breath came fast, but he nodded and stepped forward. The book landed in his hands with a weight far beyond its pages. He began to read. His voice was high, almost squeaky, but earnest. "Now stormy winter with his rougher sway." The rhythm returned, another tide of lines rolling out, steady and unwavering. The children sagged against their desks once more, surrendering to the drone. Each word became less a message and more a sound, soft and unending, like raindrops on a roof. Peter stumbled but caught himself, cheeks burning. He pressed onward, his eyes swimming across the dense lines of text. He spoke of frost, of frozen rivers, of nights long and dark. The irony was not lost on anyone. The poem described their very moment, the chill in their toes, the grey sky beyond the glass, the dull hush of endless winter. The classroom was no longer simply a place of learning. It had become part of the poem itself, swallowed by its imagery. They were not listeners now, but characters caught in verse, trapped in rhyme. And perhaps without meaning to, the punishment succeeded. For in that dreary sameness, in that steady rhythm, minds softened, wills bent, and silence reigned. Mr. Barrow closed his eyes briefly, as if savouring the control. The book was his cane, the verses his strikes, and the children, docile, weary, nearly lulled to sleep, were proof of his method. When Peter finally closed the book, his hands trembled with relief. He sank back into his seat, his heart still racing, but his body already surrendering to the same dull stillness that blanketed the room. The silence grew once again, thick and heavy, like a quilt spread over the classroom, and the clock ticked on. The next morning arrived with the same heavy greyness that seemed to belong to every Victorian sky. Clouds pressed low, as if eager to peek through the classroom windows and join the lesson themselves. The children shuffled in, their boots leaving faint trails of damp on the stone floor. Their breath hung in the cold air, faint clouds that dissolved as quickly as they came. Mr. Barrow was already at his desk, polishing his spectacles with a square of cloth. His moustache twitched with its usual precision, his eyes sharp but calm. He had arranged the great poetry book in the centre, a monument of discipline, its spine cracked from years of reluctant readings. Today the children already knew what awaited them. They'd spoken too loudly in the cloakroom, tugged each other's scarves, laughed when laughter was not permitted. That was enough. In this world, laughter itself was a crime that poetry could punish. The first to be called was Edith, a small girl with a neat braid and a nervous smile. She held the book as though it were heavier than she was, the leather cold against her palms. She opened to the marked page and began, "Oft let me wander o'er the dewy field." Her voice was thin but clear, a small bell chiming in the fog. The verses stretched onward, describing meadows, bees, and the virtue of honest labour. For a child it was as exciting as reciting a laundry list, but that was precisely the point. The monotony pressed on, line by line, until it smoothed every restless thought. As she read, the children began to drift into that peculiar stillness again. Their eyes glazed, their heads leaned heavily against their hands. The poem was not entertainment, it was endurance. Yet in that endurance there was an odd, sleepy comfort. The cadence of rhyme was steady, like the rocking of a carriage on a cobblestone road, or the hum of a kettle left to boil too long. One boy's stomach rumbled faintly, the sound oddly loud in the quiet. He imagined instead of poetry he might be forced to memorize the names of cakes. Seed cake, sponge cake, plum loaf, bath buns sticky with sugar. How different that punishment would have been. Tedious, yes, but sweet in imagination. Compared to that, Thompson's endless verses of bees and fields felt dry as chalk. But then again, isn't boredom itself a kind of flavour? Not sweet, not savoury, but bland, like porridge left too long on the stove. The Victorians seemed to believe that blandness built character, that patience seasoned the spirit better than sugar. Edith faltered, stumbling on a long word, industriousness, and the class stirred. Mr. Barrow raised a hand, and silence returned at once. She corrected herself, cheeks hot, then trudged onward. And so it went, verse after verse, rhyme after rhyme, until the air itself seemed filled with bees and fields, though no one cared for them. By the time she closed the book, her voice had grown hoarse. She placed it gently on the desk, as though tucking it back into slumber. Mr. Barrow nodded. "Well done," he said, though whether he meant it as praise or as approval for her endurance was unclear. The children exhaled together, a small chorus of relief, but they knew it would not be the last reading. Another would be called soon, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, and all the while the clock ticked on, carrying them forward through a day that felt endless, a day built not of hours but of lines. And so the classroom returned to its silence, the verses still humming faintly in their ears, like a song you did not want to remember but could not forget. The fog of yesterday had not lifted. If anything, it had thickened, wrapping the streets and houses in a damp shawl. By the time the children filed back into the classroom, the hair was damp with mist, and their coats smelled faintly of wool gone wet. They stamped their boots against the floor, though softly, for stamping too loudly might earn them another recitation. Mr. Barrow greeted them with his usual nod. He did not smile, but he did not scowl either. His expression was the steady line of a man who believed deeply in routine. The poetry book lay open already, as though it had been waiting all night for its next victim. Today it was Samuel who was chosen first. Samuel was not a mischievous boy, not especially, but he had dawdled too long at the inkstand, letting drops splatter onto the desk. That was enough. In a world of strict discipline, even ink stains were crimes worthy of verse. He rose reluctantly, his chair scraping in protest, and took the book from Mr. Barrow's hand. His fingers left faint smudges on the worn cover. He glanced down at the passage assigned to him, lips moving silently before he dared to speak aloud. Lo, the pale morn in saffron mantle dressed. His voice was slow, dragging each word as though it weighed a pound. The children shifted, sinking into the familiar rhythm. The verses described dawn, the sky softening into day, yet in Samuel's monotone it became less a sunrise and more a curtain slowly, painfully being pulled aside. The children listened without listening. Their eyes drooped. One girl traced the grain of the wood with her fingertip. Another boy stared at the faint plume of smoke rising from the fire, imagining shapes in it. A loaf of bread, a curl of butter, perhaps even a steaming pudding. How strange, he thought, that his hunger could transform smoke into supper. But the poem dragged on, describing not puddings or pies, but the industrious farmer, the obedient plough horse, the virtues of early rising. To the Victorians, such verses were lessons. Life was duty, not pleasure. A hot bun might feed you for a moment, but a moral line was meant to feed you forever. Samuel stumbled over resplendent, his tongue heavy with the syllables. Mr. Barrow corrected him gently but firmly, and Samuel repeated it, slower this time, until the word sat properly in the air. Then he trudged onward, each couplet a brick laid in the wall of tedium. And yet, for all its dullness, there was a curious peace in it. The sound of Samuel's voice was steady, unhurried, predictable. Like the rocking of a boat on calm water, or the hum of bees in a field, it soothed even as it wearied. Some children, though wide awake, felt the peculiar heaviness that comes before sleep. Their minds wandered. The poem became less about dawn and more about the rhythm itself, a sound without meaning, an endless murmur that blurred thought into haze. At last, Samuel closed the book, his hands trembling slightly. He sat down quickly, eager to sink into the anonymity of his desk once again. The silence that followed was thick. The children barely breathed, waiting for the teacher's decision, another reading or a pause. Mr. Barrow let the quiet linger, savouring its weight. Finally, he closed the book with deliberate slowness. "That will do," he said simply. The children relaxed, but only slightly. They knew the book would open again before the day was done. It always did, and so they returned to their silence, a silence that was never empty, for it carried the hum of verses still echoing in their minds, lines about mornings and fields, about duty and obedience, about a world where even poetry was a tool of discipline. And as the clock ticked on, steady as ever, the lesson of the day settled upon them like the fog outside, heavy, unchanging, and strangely soothing in its sameness. The day had hardly begun, and yet in the classroom it already felt old. The grey light spilling through the windows was thin like watered milk, and the fire in the grate offered only a token warmth, the kind that teased but never satisfied. The children shuffled in, weary from the walk through the damp streets, their boots leaving smudges on the stone floor. Mr. Barrow was waiting, as always, his tall figure framed against the blackboard. The poetry book rested open upon his desk, its pages slightly curled, as if even the paper had grown tired of itself. He adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and let the silence stretch until the children sat perfectly still. Today it was Alice who'd drawn the teacher's eye. Her offence was small, whispering to a friend as they set down their slates. But in this world of rigid rules, even a whisper carried the weight of rebellion. Mr. Barrow pointed, and Alice rose at once. The book was handed to her. Its leather cover was cool and slightly damp, as though it too had absorbed the fog of the morning. She opened to the marked passage, lips moving silently before her small voice carried the words aloud. Now, cheerful spring, with opening blossoms crowned. Her tone was delicate, barely more than a murmur, but the silence of the room carried it clearly to every corner. The lines unfurled, each describing flowers and budding fields, yet in her voice they became almost indistinguishable from one another, a steady trickle of sound like water leaking from a spout. The children listened with half-shut eyes. Some imagined the blossom she spoke of, though none of them could feel spring in their bones that cold morning. Others drifted into their own thoughts, of sweet buns from the baker's stall, still warm and sugared, or of roasted chestnuts sold in paper cones by vendors in the street. Compared to those smells, these verses of blossoms were thin fare indeed. But that was the nature of the punishment. Sweetness was withheld. Instead, they were fed the bland, steady diet of duty and rhyme. It was like being offered porridge when your heart longed for cake. Sufficient, perhaps, but never delightful. Alice stumbled once, her voice faltering on the word effulgent. Mr. Barrow raised a brow, and she repeated it carefully, as though the word itself were a pebble she'd tripped over. Then she pressed on, her voice weaving through the lines with all the urgency of a snail crossing a garden path. The rhythm of it lulled the room. Even those who'd begun the morning restless now sat quiet, their chins propped on their hands, their minds adrift. The poem was endless, circling and circling, until meaning itself dissolved. What remained was only cadence, a slow tide of syllables rolling in and out, in and out. Isn't it peculiar how monotony can tame as surely as fear? The Victorians believed it. They believed that patience, drilled into the body by long, dull tasks, would build character as surely as discipline delivered by the cane. Poetry was not beauty here, it was endurance. When Alice finally closed the book, she exhaled softly, her hands trembling from the strain of holding it so long. She sat down quickly, her braid falling forward over her shoulder as she lowered her gaze to the desk. Mr. Barrow gave a single nod. Nothing more was needed. The silence, the obedience, the stillness of 30 children was evidence enough that the verses had done their work. The clock ticked on, each second long and deliberate, like the measured steps of a man walking down an endless corridor. The lesson was not over, but for now the book was shut, and the classroom settled once more into that peculiar Victorian quiet, heavy, grey, and strangely soothing, like a lullaby sung not for comfort but for control. The morning bells had barely faded across the fog-bound town when the children settled once more at their desks. Their coats still smelled faintly of damp wool, and their cheeks were pink from the chill air. Inside the classroom, the familiar hush returned quickly, as though silence itself had taken its seat before any of them arrived. Mr. Barrow stood at the front, spectacles glinting faintly. His tall clock ticked behind him, a steady companion to every lesson. Upon the desk lay the inevitable book, its leather cracked, its edges softened from decades of reluctant hands. It needed no introduction. Every child knew that before long, one of them would be chosen. The first name spoken was Benjamin. He was a boy with restless legs, always tapping his heel under the desk, a sound he thought went unnoticed. Today, it had not. He rose stiffly, his tapping silenced, and took the book from the teacher's hand. The passage given to him began with lofty solemnity. Sweet is the breath of vernal shower, the bee's low murmur greets the ear. The words were flowery, yet Benjamin's delivery was flat, heavy with reluctance. Each line fell like a stone into a pond, slow, certain, rippling outward until the classroom itself seemed submerged in its still water. The children listened without listening, their bodies slumped, their eyes half-lidded. The poem spoke of fields, of bees, of patient industry, but in that room it became nothing more than a gentle drone. Boredom, pure and uninterrupted. Isn't it strange how monotony can be its own kind of music, like the hum of a kettle on the hearth, or the creak of a rocking chair that never changes pace? Benjamin's voice carried that same quality, dull, predictable, yet oddly soothing if you surrendered to it. One girl imagined instead the scent of sugared almonds from a street stall, warm and sweet in a paper twist. Another thought of meat pies cooling on a baker's sill. Compared to those indulgent aromas, the verses of bees and blossoms tasted thin, like cold broth without salt. And yet, perhaps that was the point. To make the sweetness of life seem rarer, one first had to endure the flavourless. Benjamin stumbled on a line confusing luxuriant for luminous. Mr. Barrow's cough corrected him without words. The boy flushed, then trudged on, slower this time, as though each syllable were a stone he had to lift and set down carefully. The room grew warmer with the press of bodies, though the fire had dwindled to a faint glow. The air smelled of chalk and damp cloth, mingling with the faint ash of yesterday's coal. It was a scent not unpleasant, but heavy, the sort that lingered long after the lesson ended. At last, Benjamin reached the end of the marked passage. He closed the book with both hands, grateful for its weight to be gone. He sank back into his seat, legs folded tight so they could not betray him with restless tapping again. The silence that followed was immense, filling the cracks of the room like fog through cobblestones. Mr. Barrow gave a single nod. Good, that was all. The book remained closed for now, but its presence was a constant shadow. The children shifted slightly, shoulders relaxing, though they knew well the respite would not last. The clock ticked on, slow and deliberate. The verses still echoed faintly in their minds, as if spoken not aloud but inwardly, words marching in endless rhythm. And in that rhythm, discipline and drowsiness became indistinguishable, each line a step deeper into the grey Victorian quiet that pressed upon them all. The sky outside had not changed. Grey upon grey, clouds layered like worn blankets over the rooftops. The lamplighter had passed hours earlier, and yet the day seemed no brighter for his work. In the classroom, the foggy light spilled weakly across the blackboard, its pale glow settling into every crack of the old stone walls. The children sat waiting. They had learned that anticipation was part of the punishment itself. At any moment the book might open, and one of their names might be spoken. The silence was not peace, but a weight pressing over their shoulders, as heavy as the wool of their coats. Mr. Barrow tapped the great volume with his knuckle. Thump. A sound as soft as a heartbeat, yet loud enough to remind them that poetry ruled this room. He let his eyes travel slowly across the rows. Finally, he said, "Margaret." A hush fell deeper. Margaret was a thoughtful girl, known for neat handwriting and steady composure. She rose quietly, her braids brushing against her shoulders. When the book was placed into her hands, she held it with care, as though its cracked leather deserved reverence. She began to read, "See where the silver Thames through meadows rolls." Her voice was clear, not too loud, not too soft. The words painted an image of flowing water, of gentle fields, of cattle grazing beneath the sky. Yet in that classroom, With its draft creeping through the windows and its smell of chalk dust, the river seemed very far away. The poem became not a picture but a rhythm, a steady trickle of syllables that slipped one after another like drops from a leaky roof. The children leaned into the sound. Some closed their eyes, their minds drifting toward the image of water, not the rushing kind, but slow, heavy, winding, the sort that lulled rather than stirred. Others thought of food again, loaves resting by the hearth, their crusts dark and crackling, or treacle puddings dripping with syrup. Compared to such richness, these verses of rivers and cattle felt bland. Yet perhaps that blandness was precisely why it worked. Isn't it curious how monotony blurs the edges of thought? A punishment meant to sharpen discipline also softened the mind, like warm milk before sleep. Margaret stumbled only once on indefatigable. Mr. Barrow corrected her, his voice low but precise, and she repeated the word carefully, as though polishing it before setting it back in place. Then she carried on, her tone steady, her breath even. The classroom seemed to shrink around her voice. The fire gave a faint crack, then fell back into silence. The clock ticked steadily, each sound weaving itself between the lines of verse. The fog pressed harder against the window, but made no sound of its own. All that remained was Margaret's slow recital, each line like a footstep echoing down an endless hallway. At last she reached the end of the passage. She closed the book gently, almost tenderly, and handed it back to Mr. Barrow. Then she sat, folding her hands neatly on her desk, her face calm. Mr. Barrow gave a single nod of approval. He did not smile, but his moustache twitched faintly, a sign that order pleased him. The children exhaled together, not loudly but with the faintest sound, like a breeze stirring leaves. For the moment the book was shut. The moment would not last, but even the brief pause felt like a reprieve. And so, once again, the rhythm of the classroom returned to its familiar state. Silence, heavy as a quilt, with the faint hum of remembered verses lingering in the air, soft as a lullaby sung under one's breath. The day had crept forward without much notice. Hours in that classroom seemed less like time and more like layers of the same cloth, folded over and over until no one could tell where one ended and another began. The fire in the grate had sunk to little more than ash, but no one bothered to stir it. The grey light through the tall windows was more constant than any flame could be. The children sat in neat rows, their bodies still, but their minds already bracing for what was inevitable. They could almost sense when Mr. Barrow's hand twitched toward the great book. Its cracked spine, its curling pages, its scent of must and leather, all these had become as familiar as the sound of the ticking clock. When at last the teacher spoke, the chosen name was Edward. Edward's heart thudded, but he rose without protest. He was taller than many of the boys, though still awkward in his limbs, as though his body had grown ahead of his grace. The book landed in his hands with its usual heaviness. He stared down at the dense text, blinking quickly, and then began. The ripened harvest, bending with its load. His voice was steady enough, though tinged with reluctance. The words flowed out, describing fields of wheat, farmers reaping with scythes, the bounty of earth's labour. Yet in Edward's flat tone, those golden fields became dull stretches of straw, stretching endlessly in the imagination until they blurred into nothing. The children listened in silence. Some pictured bread rising in an oven, the smell of crust darkening, the sweetness of fresh loaves spread with butter. Against such thoughts, the harvest lines in Edward's mouth tasted like chaff, dry, fibrous, without flavour. But perhaps that was what Mr. Barrow intended, to teach them that even bounty could be dulled, that poetry was discipline, not delight. Edward's voice wavered as he encountered the word labyrinthine. He stumbled, then pronounced it slowly, syllable by syllable, as though dragging a heavy cart uphill. Mr. Barrow corrected him with a calm but firm tone, and Edward repeated it, cheeks pink with effort. Then he pressed onward, returning to the rhythm. The poem droned on, each couplet falling like the steady plod of boots on soil. Tick, tock, line after line. The classroom seemed to sway in its monotony, like a ship rolling gently on waves too small to wake the passengers. Isn't it strange how sameness stretched long enough begins to feel like comfort? The punishment was meant to discipline, but its dull rhythm lulled the children as surely as a lullaby. They leaned against their desks, their eyes heavy, their minds floating between verses and dreams. Edward finally reached the end of the assigned passage. His voice cracked a little on the last line, not from emotion but from dryness, his throat tired of carrying so many words. He shut the book with care, as though grateful not to drop it, and returned to his seat. The silence that followed was thick. For a moment the classroom seemed to breathe together, all 30 children exhaling softly, as though relieved to be free again, if only briefly. Mr. Barrow closed the book with one hand, fingers drumming lightly on the cover. "Well done," he said, though the phrase sounded less like praise and more like the closing of a door. The clock ticked on. The day had not ended, nor had the lessons, but for the moment the classroom sat in its peculiar hush, heavy, monotonous, and strangely soothing, the kind of quiet that settled into the bones like the hum of a far-off wheel turning without end. By the time the next day crept across the windows, the classroom already felt weary. The fog outside was no longer new, it was simply part of life, like the smell of chalk dust or the creak of benches. The children slipped into their seats with the slow obedience of habit, boots thudding dully against stone, coats smelling of coal smoke from the streets. On the desk, the poetry book lay open again. It seemed to breathe with the room, its curled pages rising slightly in the draught. The children glanced at it now and then, as though it might suddenly speak their names even before Mr. Barrow did. The teacher's gaze wandered calmly across the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not frown. Instead, he simply said, "Charlotte." A ripple of stillness spread. Charlotte was a quiet child, her hair tied in a plain knot, her face pale in the thin light. She rose, took the book and held it gently as though it might crumble if grasped too tightly. When she began, her voice was soft, a hush within a hush. The twilight grey with solemn silence falls. The room seemed to lean into her words. The verses spoke of evenings settling across fields, of shepherds gathering their flocks, of quiet skies fading into darkness. Yet in Charlotte's flat, careful tone, it became not a painting of nature but a slow chant, one word after another, without colour or urgency. The children sank into the sound. Some imagined the twilight she described, though in their minds it was not golden or lovely but grey upon grey, just as their own morning was. Others let their thoughts wander to food again, perhaps the evening meals awaiting them at home, a stew simmering faintly, or bread crusts dipped in broth. Compared to such real comforts, the poem's twilight was thin, flavourless, yet somehow steadying. Isn't it curious how repetition itself begins to feel like warmth, like the drumming of rain on a roof, or the rhythm of a wheel turning endlessly? Charlotte's voice carried that same drone, an unbroken stream that asked nothing but patience. She faltered once at melancholy, her tongue tangling in the syllables. Mr. Barrow corrected her softly, his hand raised, and she repeated the word, slower this time, as though walking carefully across a narrow bridge. Then she pressed forward. The lines described silence, but silence already ruled the room. The irony was almost comforting. A poem about quiet delivered into a space where no one dared whisper, where even the coughs had been swallowed into stillness. The fire in the grate had given up entirely, leaving only a faint trace of warmth. The smell of ash clung in the air, mixing with the faint iron tang of ink. The children hardly noticed. They were too deep in the rhythm of Charlotte's voice, which moved like a slow tide across the floor. At last she reached the end of the assigned verses. She closed the book gently, almost apologetically, and handed it back to Mr. Barrow. Then she sat, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes lowered. The teacher gave a slight nod. He did not need to say more. The silence of 30 children was the proof of his method. The clock ticked on, slow and deliberate. Outside, the fog clung to the glass. Inside, the children sat adrift in that peculiar Victorian lull, half discipline, half drowsiness, all of it blending into the same long, unbroken monotone that pressed them further into quiet obedience. The morning had barely begun, yet the classroom already felt wrapped in its familiar heaviness. The fog outside was thicker than ever, coating the windows with a pale film that blurred the world beyond into shapeless shadows. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool, chalk dust, and the faintest trace of coal smoke that had drifted in from the street. The children sat quietly, their small bodies lined neatly behind the wooden desks. They knew the pattern well by now. The book would open, a name would be called, and the long recitation would begin. It was not fear that filled the room, but resignation. The kind of weariness that comes when one has seen the same day arrive again and again. Mr. Barrow stood at the front, his spectacles gleaming faintly. The poetry book rested upon his desk, its cracked spine and curled pages waiting. He let the silence stretch for a moment, as if silence itself were the first lesson of the day. Then, without haste, he spoke. The girl startled slightly, then rose. She smoothed her apron with nervous hands and accepted the book. Its leather was cool, rough against her palms. She opened to the marked page, the faint smell of old paper rising like dust. Her voice trembled at first, but soon found a steadier rhythm. The gentle moon with silver radiance fair. The children leaned into the sound. Her tone was careful, unembellished. Each word dropped into the air like a pebble falling into still water. The verses spoke of moonlight over quiet fields, of owls gliding softly, of stars faintly burning in the heavens. Yet in Harriet's flat recital, the beauty of the night was drained away, leaving only cadence, cadence, cadence. Isn't it strange how even words meant for wonder can be dulled by monotony? The moon reduced to a pale shape, the stars no brighter than chalk dust, and yet the dullness itself had a charm. The rhythm of Harriet's voice was steady, soothing. Some children felt their eyelids droop. Others drifted into daydreams. One boy imagined treacle tarts cooling on a windowsill, another pictured roasted chestnuts wrapped in paper. Against such warm thoughts, the moon and stars of the poem seemed thin and tasteless. But perhaps that contrast made the daydreams sweeter still. Harriet stumbled on the word resplendence. Mr. Barrow's gaze corrected her without a word, and she tried again, slower, her voice catching slightly before smoothing out once more. She pressed onward, unwilling to falter again. The classroom seemed to shrink around her. The ticking of the tall clock filled the gaps between her lines. The fire had not been lit this morning, and the cold crept in, but her slow recital almost covered it, the rhythm working like a heavy quilt of sound. The children listened in silence, but it was not the silence of attention. It was the silence of surrender. They had given themselves to the verses, allowed them to wash over like a tide that never broke. At last, Harriet reached the end. She closed the book gently, her hands trembling with both effort and relief. She passed it back to the teacher and returned to her seat, cheeks flushed but eyes lowered. Mr. Barrow gave a small nod. The book closed with a soft thump, but every child knew it would open again before the day was done. The silence returned, deep and steady. The clock ticked, the fog pressed against the glass, and the children sat in their familiar hush. A hush built not of peace, but of the dull rhythm of rhyme, punishment, and lullaby woven into one. The fog outside had not lifted. It rarely did. By now, the children barely noticed its grey presence pressing against the tall windows. It was as much a part of their school days as the ticking of the clock or the scrape of chalk across slate. They filed into the classroom in silence, carrying with them the smell of damp coats and leather boots. Mr. Barrow stood waiting, his back straight, his hands folded neatly. The great poetry book lay on the desk, open as though it had never been shut. Its pages curled gently at the edges, breathing in the draught that slid through the cracks of the window frame. The children lowered their eyes, waiting. Today it was Thomasina who was chosen. She was neither the youngest nor the oldest, neither the loudest nor the quietest. Her offence was trivial. She had dropped her slate and the clatter had broken the morning silence. That was enough. She rose slowly, smoothed her apron and accepted the book. It seemed heavier than it was, a burden out of proportion to its size. The leather was cold against her fingers, and the faint smell of must and ink rose as she opened it. She began to read. Soft falls the evening o'er the shaded glen. Her voice was thin but steady, a high note carried without tremor. The verses spoke of valleys at dusk, of birds returning to their nests, of stillness after the labour of the day. Yet, in her flat recital, all the colour drained away. The glen was not green but grey. The birds did not sing but merely circled silently in the mind. The children listened, not because they wished to, but because there was nothing else to hear. Some leaned forward, their elbows on the desk, their heads resting on their palms. Others stared at the fireless grate, seeing only the faint trace of ash left from yesterday. And yet, in the monotony, there was comfort. Each line followed the next with certainty. No surprises, no sudden changes. Like the rocking of a cradle, or the hum of a wheel turning endlessly, Thomasina's voice carried them into a quiet that was not chosen, but accepted. Isn't it odd how punishment can sound so much like lullaby? The Victorians might have believed they were teaching duty and obedience, but in truth, they had discovered something else. The hypnotic rhythm of boredom, capable of taming a restless room better than fear itself. Thomasina faltered on undulating. She pronounced it too quickly, stumbled and blushed. Mr. Barrow lifted a finger, and she corrected herself, slower this time, the syllables heavy on her tongue. Then she pressed forward, each new line sounding more weary than the last. The verses carried on about fields of labourers, about oxen plodding steadily homeward, about the virtue of patience. To the children, they became no more than sound, meaning blurred by the sameness of rhyme. Their minds drifted elsewhere. One imagined a steaming pie, another the crackle of sugared nuts, another a warm loaf broken open on a kitchen table. Such thoughts were sweeter than poetry, but even they were tinged with the same grey dullness that filled the room. At last, Thomasina reached the end. She closed the book carefully, almost reverently, and handed it back to the teacher. Then she sank into her seat, her breath faint but steady, her shoulders sagging in relief. Mr. Barrow nodded once, his approval silent but understood. The children exhaled together, the sound soft as a sigh. The clock ticked on, its pendulum swinging in perfect rhythm with the remembered lines. The day had not ended, nor had the verses, but for a time the room sat wrapped in silence, a silence built not of peace but of patient surrender, as though the very air had learned to wait. The fog still lingered, though now it carried with it the faint smell of coal smoke from chimneys, drifting into the classroom through unseen cracks. The tall windows were streaked with condensation, and every so often a droplet slid down the glass, leaving behind a wavering trail. Inside, the children sat stiffly, their hands folded on the worn wood of their desks, waiting for what they knew must come. Mr. Barrow stood tall, his figure framed against the blackboard. His spectacles caught the pale light flashing briefly like coins. On the desk before him lay the poetry book, always the same, its cracked spine and curled corners a constant reminder of discipline. The silence was so complete that even the tick of the tall clock sounded like a hammer striking stone. This time his eyes fell on George, a boy of average height with ink-stained fingers and a restless twitch in his leg. That twitch had betrayed him. Mr. Barrow had noticed. A nod, a gesture, and George stood, his face pink, his heart thudding. The book was handed to him. Its weight was more than paper and leather. It was the weight of expectation, of duty. He opened it clumsily, his fingers fumbling, and began. The bending grain beneath the sickle falls. His voice was uneven at first, but soon it steadied into the familiar drone. The verses spoke of harvest once again, of toil, of the noble rhythm of labour. Yet in George's tone they became heavy, colourless, a slow march of syllables across the still air. The children let the sound wash over them. Some stared at the floor, tracing cracks in the stone with their eyes. Others glanced at the windows, imagining beyond them the vendors selling sugared buns, roasted chestnuts, or meat pies wrapped in cloth. Against such thoughts, The endless fields of verse felt like gruel, filling, perhaps, but never satisfying. And yet there was a rhythm to it that could not be denied. George's words fell one after another, each like the tread of boots on a long road. Not fast, not slow, simply steady. And in that steadiness the children felt themselves drifting, minds softening, bodies sinking deeper into stillness. Isn't it peculiar how tedium can soothe? How the very thing meant to exhaust the spirit instead numbs it into calm? That was the hidden power of poetry in punishment. It lulled as much as it disciplined. George stumbled on reverberating. He muttered the syllables wrong, and Mr. Barrow's sharp gaze corrected him without sound. The boy swallowed, tried again, slower, until the word fit properly into place. Then he trudged onward, the rhythm unbroken. The fire had long since gone cold. Ash sat like grey snow in the grate. The air was chilly enough that fingers ached, yet George's voice filled the room with a kind of warmth. Not real warmth, but the blanket of monotony that settled heavy over every desk. At last, he reached the end. His voice cracked slightly on the final line, his throat dry, but he closed the book with a soft thump and handed it back. His legs trembled faintly as he sank into his seat. Mr. Barrow nodded once, his moustache twitching in the faintest sign of approval. Nothing more was said. Nothing more was needed. The silence returned, thicker than before. The verses still lingered, echoing faintly in the children's minds like a hum that would not stop. The clock ticked, steady, patient, endless. And once again the classroom surrendered to its peculiar Victorian hush. Grey, monotonous, and strangely soothing. A lullaby woven not of melody but of rhyme. The morning began with a silence so thick it seemed to arrive before the children themselves. When they entered, their boots left damp trails on the stone, their breath puffed faintly in the cold air. The tall clock gave its steady tick-tick-tick, each sound carving the quiet into even slices. On the desk, as always, rested the book. It was not large enough to be frightening, nor sharp enough to wound, and yet its presence weighed on the room more than any cane might have. The cracked leather cover and curled edges seemed to hold not poems, but endless hours, waiting to spill themselves into young ears. Mr. Barrow's eyes moved across the rows. They landed at last on Emily. She'd been caught fidgeting, her quill scratching patterns into the wood of her desk. That was enough. A single nod, and she rose, smoothing her dress with trembling fingers. The book was placed in her hands, its pages exhaled the faint scent of must and ink. She turned to the marked passage, her eyes scanning nervously. Then she began, "O'er meadows broad the cooling zephyr strays." Her voice was soft, lilting at the edges, though flattened by caution. The verses described breezes across open fields, cattle grazing beneath calm skies, the virtues of rest after toil. Yet, in Emily's careful monotone, the breeze was no more than a sigh, the cattle no more than shadows. The children listened, their bodies still. Some closed their eyes, their minds wandering to warmer scenes. A kitchen hearth, perhaps, with a pot of stew bubbling, a tray of hot scones dusted with sugar, the sweet heaviness of treacle spread thick on bread. Against such imaginings, the poem's meadows felt thin, tasteless, like boiled water without spice. And yet that tastelessness was its power. Each line fell like the drip of water from a leaky roof, steady, inevitable, oddly soothing. Emily's voice became less about meaning and more about rhythm, a slow tide of sound that dulled the senses. Isn't it curious how words meant for beauty become soporific when stripped of colour? The Victorians may have called it virtue, but to the children it was simply a lullaby in disguise. Emily stumbled on tranquillity, the syllables tangling on her tongue. Mr. Barrow's gaze fixed on her, sharp but silent. She repeated the word, slower, each sound carefully measured. Then she continued, more cautious than before. The fire had long since died. Ash sat pale in the grate, sending up no heat. The room was chilly, but Emily's steady recitation layered over the cold like a blanket. Not warm, but heavy, pressing down until no one dared to move. At last she closed the book. The sound was soft, final, as though tucking away the very air she'd been shaping with her voice. She handed it back to Mr. Barrow, her hands pale with relief, and sat down. The teacher gave a single nod. No more was said. The verses still echoed faintly, as though etched into the stone walls themselves. The silence returned, thick and grey. The children sat motionless. The clock ticked its slow rhythm, and the morning drifted onward, carrying them further into the endless monotone that ruled their days. The day began with the sound of dripping. Somewhere outside, rain tapped against the roof and slid down the glass of the tall windows, each drop leaving behind thin streaks that blurred the view beyond. The children came in quietly, their coats damp, their shoes squeaking faintly on the stone. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet wool and faint coal dust. Mr. Barrow stood at the front as steady as ever. The poetry book was already open on his desk, its spine stretched, its corners curling as though even it were weary of its duty. The tall clock gave its patient rhythm, tick after tick, reminding everyone that time in this room belonged not to them but to the verses. Today the name he spoke was Joseph. The boy startled, then rose. His hands were ink-stained, his collar slightly askew. He stepped forward reluctantly, and the book was set into his arms, its weight pressed down on him, heavy not with paper but with the certainty of monotony. He opened to the passage. His eyes moved slowly across the lines, and then his voice joined the rhythm of the room. "Behold the ploughman to the furrow bent." The words rolled out like clods of earth turned by a blade. The verses spoke of soil, of honest labour, of sweat and duty beneath the pale sun. But in Joseph's flat recital, the earth was not rich, the sweat not noble. Everything was grey, the furrows stretching endlessly across a field that had no end. The children sank into the sound. Some thought of bread, coarse and plain, the kind made from such furrows. A crust broken open, steam rising, a smear of butter melting across the surface. Compared to that image, the poem felt dry as chaff, and yet the dullness of it was soothing. Like porridge without sugar, it filled the room with heaviness rather than flavour. Isn't it strange how monotony can quiet 100 restless hearts? The Victorians believed patience was the highest virtue, and so they served patience in measured lines of verse. The cane stung and faded. Poetry lingered dull and endless. Joseph stumbled over assiduous. His tongue tangled, his cheeks burned. Mr. Barrow gave a single sharp nod, and Joseph tried again, slower, careful, as though each syllable were a stone he had to place in a wall. Then he pressed on, the rhythm never breaking fully. The rain tapped harder against the glass. The fire in the grate gave only a faint whisper of heat, the smell of ash mixing with the damp scent of the children's coats. Yet Joseph's voice filled the room more than either. Each line was another drop, another step, another weight laid upon the morning. At last, the passage ended. Joseph closed the book too quickly, the sound louder than he intended. A few children blinked at the sharpness of it. He handed it back to Mr. Barrow with trembling fingers, then sank into his seat, his shoulders slumping. The teacher's moustache twitched faintly, his version of approval. He placed the book back on the desk, shut once more but never truly silent. The classroom breathed again, though faintly, as if afraid to disturb the verses still echoing in the air. The clock ticked on, slow and certain, and the rain continued its steady tapping. And so, discipline settled over them once more, not in sharpness or fear, but in the slow, heavy drone of rhyme that made the day blur into sameness. The morning light was pale, slipping weakly through the tall windows. It touched the rows of desks with a thin sheen, as though the sun itself hesitated to enter the room. The children sat in silence, their hands folded, their eyes lowered. The tick of the clock marked the moments with a steady certainty, each sound as soft and inevitable as breathing. On the master's desk, the poetry book waited. It had become more than a book. It was ritual, symbol, inevitability. The cracked leather cover seemed almost alive, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. The children did not need to wonder who would be chosen. They simply waited for a name, knowing it would come. Today, it was Margaret. Her chair scraped softly against the floor as she rose. She was small, her braids neatly tied with fading ribbons. She stepped forward, hands trembling only slightly, and accepted the book. Its weight pressed into her arms, heavy with the memory of voices that had come before her. She opened to the passage and began. Low golden fields beneath the setting rays. Her voice was higher than the boys', more delicate but no less monotone. The verses painted pictures of evening, of warm light falling across haystacks and barns, of peace after labour. Yet in her delivery, the golden fields dulled to grey, the haystacks became shapeless shadows, the peace a quiet so heavy it lulled rather than lifted. The children listened, some with eyes half closed, others staring at the pale glow on the window. Their minds wandered to food, as always, to sugared almonds wrapped in paper, to roasted apples steaming from the oven, to gingerbread that crumbled sweetly between the teeth. Compared to such imaginings, the poem's harvest felt tasteless, like broth without salt. And yet that tastelessness carried them. Margaret's voice was steady, each line falling with the regularity of a pendulum swing. No surprise, no flourish, only sameness. And in that sameness, the children felt themselves sink deeper into quiet, their restless bodies subdued. Isn't it remarkable how predictability soothes? The Victorians dressed it in the language of morality, of duty and discipline. But in truth it was the hum of repetition that tamed young spirits more than any stern word. Margaret faltered on resplendent, her lips catching awkwardly. Mr. Barrow raised an eyebrow, and she tried again, slower, careful, as though balancing the syllables on a thin rope. Then she pressed forward, her voice regaining its flat rhythm. The fireless grate gave no warmth. The air was cold enough that breath faintly misted in front of lips. Still, Margaret's words draped over the chill like a heavy cloth, not warming, but muffling. At last she reached the end. She closed the book with care, the sound muted, final. Handing it back, she let out a breath she had held through every line. She returned to her seat, her ribbons brushing against her shoulders. Mr. Barrow gave a small, silent nod. That was all. The silence returned, thick and certain, layered with the echo of the verses. The clock ticked. The rain beyond the glass had softened to a drizzle, and the children, subdued by monotony, sank further into the rhythm of a day that blurred into itself, as grey and endless as the poetry they were made to recite. The classroom was colder that morning. A faint draught crept along the floor, swirling around boots and skirts, making the children draw their arms closer to themselves. The tall windows glowed faintly with winter light, pale and distant, as though the sun had forgotten the earth entirely. The book lay on the desk, its cover dark against the grain of the wood. It had been opened and closed so many times that the leather sagged at its hinges. The children looked at it with the same resignation they might give to a meal of boiled cabbage, unchanging, inevitable, filling but never delightful. Mr. Barrow's eyes moved along the rows until they settled on Clara. She stood quietly, her chair scraping with a sound that echoed more than it should have. Her shoes clicked softly on the stone as she came forward. The book was handed to her, heavy, certain. She opened it and began. Upon the hill, the shepherd tends his sheep. Her voice was clear but flattened, each syllable weighed down with caution. The verses described open hillsides, sheep grazing calmly, the virtue of humble care. Yet in her steady recital the hills became blank slopes, the sheep shadows without detail, the shepherd no more than a figure outlined in fog. The children listened with heavy stillness. Their thoughts slipped, as they always did, to food that might comfort. A bowl of broth with bread soaked soft, a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, a tart filled with stewed plums. Compared to these imagined flavours, the poem was thin, watery, without savour. But that thinness was its spell. Clara's voice came steady, even, without peaks or valleys. Like the ticking of the clock, it went on without pause, hypnotic in its sameness. The children's eyelids grew heavier, their bodies sinking deeper into the silence of the room. Strange, isn't it? how a punishment could serve also as a lullaby. What was meant to discipline also dulled, soothing with its very monotony. The Victorians believed that patience built virtue, and so they poured patience into verses, drop after drop, until even the most restless spirit yielded. Clara stumbled on idyllic. She pressed the wrong stress, then flushed. Mr. Barrow's stern glance corrected her without words. She repeated it slower, softer, until it fit properly into the line. Then she carried on, the rhythm unbroken. The grate held nothing but a faint scatter of ash. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and dust. Still, Clara's words filled the space more than warmth ever could, covering the cold with their steady murmur. At last she finished. The final line fell softly, and she closed the book with care, the thump muffled. She returned it to Mr. Barrow, then walked back to her seat, her face pale but calm. The teacher gave his small nod, his moustache twitching faintly. That was all the approval she would receive, and all that was needed. The silence folded itself over the room again. The clock ticked. The pale light did not change, and the children sat, lulled by the monotone that had become as much a part of their days as breath or bread, each hour blending into the next with the weight of unbroken verse. The morning began with frost. Thin patterns like lace clung to the corners of the tall windows, and the light that entered was silver, not gold. The air held a bite sharp enough that the children's breath misted faintly as they settled into their places. Scarves had been unwound, mittens tucked away, but the cold still lingered, pressing at fingers and cheeks. On the master's desk rested the poetry book, as it always did. The cover was slightly warped, its edges softened from years of handling. No one spoke of it, but all felt its presence. It was both ordinary and heavy, the way a stone might be when carried in the pocket. Always there, always waiting. Mr. Barrow cleared his throat, and the name he spoke was Thomas. The boy rose with slow reluctance, his chair scraping faintly behind him. He was taller than many of the others, his boots scuffed, his collar loose. He walked to the front, and the book was placed in his hands. It pressed against his palms, solid, unchanging. He turned to the marked passage and began, "Bright dawn arises o'er the silent vale." His voice was steady, though pitched lower, filling the room with a quiet hum. The verses painted a dawn of soft light, birdsong, and promise of labour. Yet in his monotone delivery, dawn seemed little more than another shade of grey, birdsong muted, promise dissolved into nothingness. The children listened, eyes heavy. Their thoughts slid elsewhere, to the warmth of porridge sweetened with treacle, to the crunch of toasted bread, to the comfort of tea poured steaming into cups. Compared to such comforts, the poem felt thin, like broth boiled too long, leaving behind only water and faint memory. And yet that thinness soothed them. Thomas's voice came like the rhythm of a pendulum, each word a step, each line a repetition. The sameness of it pressed upon them like a quilt, not warm but heavy, enough to still fidgeting hands and wandering eyes. Isn't it peculiar how dullness wears down resistance? The Victorians prized endurance, and so they offered children endurance in the form of verse. The sting of a cane was sharp but brief. The drone of poetry was long, relentless, and strangely calming in its weight. Thomas stumbled on effulgent, his tongue twisting around it. Mr. Barrow's gaze sharpened, but no word was spoken. Thomas tried again, slower, each syllable measured like coins dropped into a box. Then he pressed on, steady, resigned. The fire in the grate had not been lit. The smell of cold stone lingered in the room. But Thomas's words filled the space more than heat might have, draping over the silence until nothing else remained. At last, the passage ended. The book closed with a muffled thud, soft but final. Thomas returned it to Mr. Barrow, then walked back to his desk, shoulders slightly lower than before. A nod was given, no more no less, approval in silence. The room fell still again. The frost on the windows glimmered faintly, the clock ticked its measured rhythm, and the children sat subdued, their morning carried forward by the endless lull of poetry, as certain and unchanging as the winter air that pressed against the glass. The day was dim before it had even begun. A mist had rolled in from the river, soft and colourless, wrapping the school in its folds. The tall windows showed only grey, no sky, no horizon, only a blur that seemed endless. Inside, the children sat with their coats still damp, their shoes leaving faint marks on the stone floor. The poetry book lay on Mr. Barrow's desk. Its spine leaned with wear, as if weary from holding so many voices. Every child glanced at it without meaning to, as though it were a bell about to toll. The name he called was Edwin. The boy rose, his movement slow, shoulders rounded as though the weight of inevitability pressed him forward. His fingers twitched slightly as he received the book. It settled into his hands with the familiar heaviness of leather and paper, a weight not only of pages but of expectation. He opened it, and his voice began its path. Soft twilight falls upon the quiet lane. His tone was flat, level, each syllable carried without flourish. The poem spoke of gentle evenings, cottages with smoke rising from chimneys, the peace of day's labour done. Yet in Edwin's steady recital, the twilight dimmed to fog, the cottages blurred into shadows, and peace became a heaviness that pressed down rather than lifted. The children listened, their eyes unfocused. Some followed the lines on their desks with fingertips, others traced the grain of the wood, their minds drifting to thoughts of roasted chestnuts warm in paper cones, to pies filled with currants, to mugs of milk warmed and sweetened with honey. Compared to such comforts, Edwin's verse was thin as water, tasteless and grey, and yet tastelessness lulled them. His words came in unbroken rhythm like footsteps on a road that led nowhere, like rain pattering on a roof without pause. No surprises, no rises or falls, only sameness. And sameness wrapped the room like a blanket of fog, dull but steady. Strange, isn't it, how monotony holds power? The Victorians used poetry as punishment not because it burned, but because it drained. Where harshness sparked resistance, dullness pressed it out, soft and relentless, until even the most restless child sat still. Edwin faltered briefly at melancholy. His tongue caught and his cheeks flushed. Mr. Barrow's eyes narrowed, but no word passed. Edwin tried again, slower, careful, each syllable placed like a brick. Then the rhythm resumed, unbroken once more. The fire in the grate was faint, a few embers glowing but little heat spreading. The room smelled of damp wool and smoke, a mixture neither pleasant nor harsh, only lingering. Over it all lay Edwin's voice, a steady thread weaving through the stillness. At last he closed the book, the sound soft, almost apologetic. He returned it to Mr. Barrow's desk and sank back into his chair, his shoulders sloping, his face pale but calm. A nod, a faint twitch of moustache, that was all the teacher gave. The silence returned, thicker than before. The mist pressed against the glass, the clock ticked on, and the children sank further into the rhythm of sameness, each moment blending into the next like fog that had no end. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows in long, pale beams, catching dust motes that drifted slowly in the still air. Each fleck floated without hurry, as though time itself had slowed. The children sat in silence, their bodies heavy with the rhythm of hours already past, their eyes following the faint shimmer of particles that seemed more alive than their own tired thoughts. Upon the master's desk, the poetry book waited. Its corners were frayed, its cover dulled from endless use, and yet it retained its presence, like an old clock that ticks regardless of who listens. The children knew its turn would come again, as certain as the toll of evening bells. The name Mr. Barrow called was Agnes. She stood quietly, her chair scraping against the stone in a sound sharper than the rest of the room. She walked forward, small shoes tapping softly, and accepted the book with both hands. It weighed upon her as though it were carved from stone. She opened it carefully, the pages fanning with the faint smell of ink and dust. Her voice, when it came, was soft, measured, steady. Beneath the elm the children play at dusk. Her tone was flat, the syllables drawn evenly, drained of lilt. The poem spoke of laughter, of games in fading light, of cheer before the supper hour. But in her monotone recital, the laughter vanished, the games stilled, the cheer muted until only grey silhouettes remained beneath a tree that seemed less an elm and more a shadow. The children listened, their faces blank. Their minds, however, slipped away. They imagined sponge cakes dusted with sugar, pots of jam thick and sweet, even a simple heel of bread spread with butter melting warm. Against such thoughts, Agnes's words felt like water thinned too much, present but without taste, and yet that thinness was its power. Her voice moved like the creak of a wheel, steady and circular, never speeding, never slowing. The sameness pressed gently against the room, muffling the restless shuffle of feet, the twitch of fingers. Curious, isn't it, how dullness becomes a discipline? A cane may sting, but its pain fades. Monotone recitation lingers, a fog that drains resistance drop by drop. The Victorians prized endurance, and so they taught it not with shouts, but with endless verse. Agnes faltered once on tranquillity, her tongue catching. Her face pinked, and she tried again, slower, careful, each syllable heavy. Mr. Barrow's stern glance fell briefly upon her, but she corrected herself and continued, the rhythm unbroken once more. The fire in the grate had long since gone cold, leaving only the faintest trace of ash. The smell of damp stone filled the corners of the room. Over it all, Agnes's voice moved steadily, weaving sameness into every ear, draping monotony over thought itself. At last, the poem ended. She closed the book gently, as though even sound should remain subdued. She placed it back upon the desk and returned to her seat, her ribbons trailing softly as she sat. A nod from Mr. Barrow, nothing more. The silence thickened again. The beams of light had shifted slightly, the dust still drifting, the clock still ticking its eternal rhythm. And the children, dulled by sameness, sat deeper in their quiet, the afternoon folding into itself like a page turned without notice. The sky outside had turned a pale slate colour, neither day nor evening, but something suspended between. The tall windows of the classroom reflected this uncertainty, showing only the faintest glow as if the light itself had grown weary. The children sat with folded hands, their faces drawn in quiet patience, their shoulders rounded under the weight of expectation. Upon the master's desk, the poetry book waited once again. Its surface was smooth from countless touch, the corners bent, its presence constant as stone. It was no longer a surprise, but a rhythm of the day, a toll that came whether one welcomed it or not. Mr. Barrow spoke the name, Margaret. She rose, slender and pale, her ribboned hair catching the dim light. Her chair made a small scrape against the floor, a sound that echoed briefly before dissolving back into silence. She approached with measured steps, her hands already prepared to receive the book. It was placed into her palms, heavy as always, not in weight alone, but in the certainty of duty. She opened to the passage, and her voice began, "The meadow blooms with blossoms fair and wide." Her tone was thin but even, a line drawn steadily across the air. The verse described flowers rising, bees humming, gentle breezes carrying fragrance. Yet as Margaret read, the blooms faded grey, the bees silent, the breezes stilled. Her monotone drained the scene of life, leaving only outline and shape. The children listened, their gazes drifting. Inwardly, they wandered toward thoughts of sugared almonds wrapped in paper, of meat pies steaming from ovens, of warm puddings with raisins swelling sweet. These imaginings carried more colour, more warmth, than any of the lines being read aloud. Compared to such comforts, the poetry was like bread gone stale. Filling, perhaps, but dry and without savour. And yet dryness had its own spell. Margaret's voice, steady and unchanging, fell upon the room like a slow rain that neither quickened nor ceased. It softened edges, dulled senses, wrapped the class in a fabric of sameness. No defiance could rise against it, for sameness smothered like fog. Isn't it peculiar how monotony bends the spirit? The Victorians, who believed in virtue through endurance, found in poetry a perfect tool. Not harsh, not loud, but steady, so steady that resistance thinned until it vanished. Margaret faltered once at Verger. Her lips pressed, her brow creased. She repeated it slowly, each sound placed with care. Mr. Barrow's gaze lingered for a breath, then eased as she pressed on, the flow unbroken once more. The fire in the grate was no more than a memory now, cold ash settling into faint patterns. The smell of damp and chalk clung to the air. Still, Margaret's words layered upon the silence, turning the greyness thicker, until it seemed the whole room floated within a single endless tone. At last, the passage ended. She closed the book carefully, the faint thump barely stirring the air. She returned it to the master's desk, curtsied slightly, then moved back to her seat. Her hands folded once more, her eyes lowered. Mr. Barrow inclined his head, the smallest acknowledgement, and the classroom settled again into its quiet. The clock ticked its slow procession. Outside, the sky remained slate, as though it too were caught in the rhythm of monotony, and the children, lulled by sameness, sank deeper into stillness, their thoughts wandering to food, warmth, and rest, even as their ears clung to the dull thread of verse. The evening crept in quietly, not with colour but with dimness, as if the light had simply grown tired and withdrawn. The tall windows of the classroom reflected nothing but shadows now, faint smudges of grey against a darker grey. The air felt cooler, a touch damp, with the faint smell of extinguished coal drifting through the hall. Upon the master's desk, the poetry book lay still, as though it had been waiting all day for this moment. Its cover sagged slightly, its edges bent, but its presence carried the weight of habit. Every child knew it would open again, and every child knew what it would bring. The name called this time was Alfred. He stood slowly, lanky and stiff, his chair scraping against the stone floor with a drawn-out sound that made several children wince. His boots echoed as he walked forward, each step heavy with inevitability. When the book was placed into his hands, his shoulders dipped, though he did not protest. He opened it, and his voice began. Low, gentle streams across the verdant field. His tone was low, steady, without ornament. The poem's words painted a scene of running water, green meadows, and birds rising in the evening air. Yet under Alfred's monotone delivery, the streams dulled to still water, the meadows grew pale, and the birds became shadows drifting without sound. The children listened without movement. Their eyes stared at nothing, unfocused. Inside, however, their thoughts slipped toward other things, toward thick slices of bread spread with dripping, toward biscuits snapped in half and dipped in tea, toward the rare sweetness of candied peel. Against such richness of imagination, Alfred's poem tasted like broth stretched too far with water, present but thin, almost absent. Yet that thinness calmed them. His words fell like steady drops from a leaking roof, each one the same as the last, each one soft enough to blur thought but steady enough to fill silence. No one fidgeted, no one spoke. The sameness pressed them into stillness. Strange, isn't it, how dullness holds more endurance than pain? A sting passes quickly, but monotony lingers, draining, softening, shaping. The Victorians understood this well, using poetry not for beauty but for discipline, stretching time into something long and heavy. Alfred stumbled once on resplendence. His mouth twisted awkwardly, his voice breaking its rhythm. Mr. Barrow's gaze rose sharply, but the boy caught himself, slowed, and pronounced it again, each syllable a careful stone laid in order. The rhythm resumed, its sameness restored. The fire in the grate had gone out hours before, leaving only faint lines of grey ash. The classroom smelled faintly of wool dampened by mist, chalk lingering in the air. Over it all, Alfred's voice continued, weaving the verses into the stillness, turning the silence thicker with each line. At last the reading ended. The book closed with a muffled thud, soft but certain. Alfred placed it upon the desk, bowed his head slightly, and returned to his seat. His long arms folded awkwardly, his gaze dropped, his shoulders eased with the relief of release. Mr. Barrow gave no more than a single nod. The silence that followed was deeper than before. The clock ticked. The mist pressed against the glass, and the children sat with quiet faces, their minds lulled by Samen.